So I am here today. I was going to say, I always start off with obviously introducing our guest, but Tuesday Talk, we didn't have one last week. And so I just want to say that if you have any questions today for us, please put them in the comments. If you hear any grunting in the background, that is my golden retriever that can't seem to stop having some sort of asthmatic issue. But I am so excited because I have wanted to talk to my guest today for a long time in a setting like this. And so my guest today is Anne Stanback, and she is a longtime women's activist as well as LGBTQ activist. So Anne, welcome. I'm so happy to see you.
Thank you, Eleni. I'm glad we finally made this happen.
I know. This is great. And it's couldn't, in the most strange way possible, the timing couldn't have been better. Because as we were just sort of chatting behind the scenes here, and we'll get into some other things, but I was truly shocked yesterday to see that both Justice Thomas and Justice Alito seem to think that we need to revisit same-sex marriage in the United States because the court created a problem that apparently only the court can fix, according to Justice Thomas. So I just wanted to get your initial reaction to that, because I know my mouth was on the ground and I was utterly speechless.
So my reaction was, but I have to say that when Donald Trump was elected president, many people said to me, "Are you afraid that the court is going to now, we're going to lose marriage equality?" And I said, no, absolutely not. I am sure that they will continue their efforts to chip away at the right through their so-called religious liberty effort, but that the right to marry is secure. And
we even said that yesterday when we were having our pre-talk. Yes. And we were talking about Roe versus Wade and how we knew that would certainly, and it was funny, even when you said it, in my head, I was like, I don't believe anymore that anything is the way it is. Anything could be overturned at this point.
Well, as I said to you, I am an optimist. I don't think I could have done this work without being an optimist.
As am I.
and you can't, for so long people said, that's impossible. And eventually they said that's inevitable.
Yep. And you made it probable.
Well, and a whole movement of people in Connecticut and around the country made it a reality. But I think it is a long way between that statement and rolling back the right to marriage. And what does that mean? Does that mean that my own marriage is invalidated? Does it mean that future marriages can't happen? What does that mean about the children of those married people?
Correct.
Perhaps later unmarried.
Right.
It is a hornet's nest of issues. And
I will tell you, I just saw a post from a friend of mine today whose wife is a trans woman. And she said, does that invalidate, does that, and beyond just the invalidation, it is also the, I think back to, before when it was, do you have the right to be in, and let's think about non-COVID times, but do you have the right to be in the emergency room? Do you have the right to be, file jointly? Do you, all of these sort of rights and privileges that apply to heterosexual couples? And you're right. What does that look like if it's repealed? Do they leave it up to the states? We keep saying that state government is becoming increasingly important, no more so than in this pandemic, because it was absolutely, everything was left up to the states, and in a way that really honestly didn't make sense in terms of a national response. But I do think about how the state legislatures are so incredibly important, and that it does matter who you're electing, because the legislation that you want to see there is only going to happen in terms of codifying things perhaps from the national level, depending on who you elect.
That's right.
You know a lot about that.
Your state legislatures matter. Your governors who appoint your Supreme Court matters, and what your state does in terms of ballot measures certainly matters.
Right.
And people may or may not remember, before we had the Obergefell final marriage decision in 2015, there was a Supreme Court case that Edie Windsor was the plaintiff in. And that was the case 2 years before Obergefell, where there were a few states that had marriage like Connecticut. But then once the Windsor case came down and said that DOMA was unconstitutional, then you saw state after state, you saw this, this rolling out of state marriages across the country. And so we have made progress in the states, but there's a reason we have the Supreme Court. Those fundamental rights have to be protected at the national level, because we know that there are states that never outlawed interracial marriage bans.
Right.
And we can't depend on states for some of the most basic rights.
That's right. And so I think that that's sort of an important segue into walking us through the highlights of Connecticut's progress in expanding the legal protections for LGBTQ people. And maybe as a part of that, if you just want to help sort of give us some definitions as well for those who are, I think that there are a lot of people who are supporters of the LGBTQ movement, but sometimes when we get past, homosexuals and lesbian women, and that people get a little confused and a little, so I think that that's an important discussion to have, because we certainly want to be as inclusive as possible.
And I think that every movement has its terminology, and that evolves, and it's important to be sensitive to that. I think our community and our movement, that terminology has moved really quickly, and I often find myself running to catch up. So I guess the first thing I would say is to understand the difference between sex and gender, because we hear that a lot. Sex has to do with biology. That's your anatomy, your genitals, your secondary sex characteristics. Gender, on the other hand, or gender identity, is your sort of deeply felt sense of who you are. Mm-hmm. And then there's sexual orientation, and that describes who you are physically or emotionally or romantically attracted to. And I think that's where sometimes people get confused about sexual orientation and being transgender. Well, being transgender isn't about sexual orientation. You can be transgender, as you said with your friend, and be heterosexual. You can be transgender and be gay or lesbian or bisexual or asexual. I think the best description that I ever heard of how to understand the difference between sexual orientation and gender identity is that sexual orientation is about who you go to bed with. Mm-hmm. Gender identity is about who you go to bed as. Yes. And that just sort of that's a great way to think about it. And I think that, again, no matter how supportive people are, I think there are stumbling blocks. And so once we get sort of the terminology blocks out of the way, then I think it's an easier way for people to, understand. And I'm just so grateful, because I've run across so many people who are so open and want to learn more and want to understand and want to be a part of the conversation. And that when they do make a mistake and they are gently corrected or not so gently corrected, they can just say, thanks so much for telling me that. That really helps me, move forward in the conversation. So that's really great. Because I think particularly around transgender issues, which is a newer community for a lot of folks, I think people might be supportive, but they feel nervous about speaking up because they're afraid they're going to make a mistake. So speak up, be open to the mild correction and show your support.
And even maybe say, I may be making a mistake here, and feel free to correct me, because that way, when you do get corrected, you don't feel like, oh, they corrected me, or, you don't, it's not, because it's not about you.
That's right.
And you don't want to, it's okay to make a mistake, and it's okay to feel like, all right, now I can move on, because we know we're on the same page, and I'm in it to win it. So
I think mostly, the LGBTQ community is so grateful when we have people, allies supporting us, and we welcome that and understand the intent behind the sentiments, even if it's not stated exactly as we might.
Well, and it's so important for all these movements to have allies, because we, even from women's suffrage, we know that, if you don't have allies, you really can't get the work done the way that you hope to get it done. And so it's always good. So just in terms of Connecticut, and I know you have been at this for so long in terms of the progress and the progress that's been made, and certainly there is still, further to go. I would just love to hear from you some of the things, maybe that you worked on, or just what you've seen over time and where you see things.
Well, certainly the work is not done in Connecticut or anywhere else, but we should be proud of the work that we've done in our state, because we have been a leader on a lot of these issues. We were one of the first states to repeal our sodomy laws, which criminalized consensual sexual behavior 30 years ago. We were also one of the first states to pass a hate crimes law in 1990. And then in 1991, that's when we passed our comprehensive, what we called at the time, the Gay Rights Bill, the Gay Rights Law. It was our comprehensive law that prohibited discrimination in employment and housing and public accommodations and credit. And that was the result of 18 years of work, but really 7 years of very intensive grassroots efforts. So that was a huge win for us. And then there were advances in the 90s, and in 2000 we became the first state to legislatively add second parent adoption to our statutes.
And we have some of the best adoption laws, I think, now in the country. So that's fantastic.
We do.
Yeah.
That's when Love Makes a Family, the group that I was a part of for almost a decade. The second parent adoption law was the first thing that we did. And then from that, we moved on to the Campaign for Marriage Equality. We had a stop along the way with civil unions in 2005. And then through our Supreme Court, and I wish you had been in the legislature back then, Eleni, because I know you would have been a yes vote from the beginning.
I would have been a yes vote.
But we didn't have all the votes we needed
Right.
In the legislature. So in 2008, that's when our Supreme Court ruled that we had the right to marry.
Yeah.
So most of those things have to do with sexual orientation. And I think where Connecticut, like the rest of the country, really lagged behind for many years and many years was in protecting transgender people.
Right.
And
I will tell you, I've had several calls about that with voters, because especially in regards to if the ACA is struck down and,
Yep.
you know, how are they going to get medical care and health care? And so, I mean, there's a lot of concern around that. And certainly, you know, I think people need to understand that transgender folks are everywhere. And so this is not, you know, something to be taken lightly. And certainly we need to make sure that we are protecting everyone, and regardless of, you know, how they see themselves.
That's right. And I think back in the early mid 80s when we started the work on the gay rights law,
Right.
gay rights bill, I don't think that many of us in our organizations knew transgender people or even knew the term transgender.
Right.
And gradually we gay and lesbians had to educate ourselves about bisexuality, about transgender people, and then since then about a whole range of other issues and communities. But it took 14 years to get transgender people included in our hate crimes bill after LGBT people had it.
Yep.
It took 20 years to be protected by non-discrimination laws after the gay rights law passed. But since then, we have added things like gender markers on birth certificates.
Yep.
Just a couple of years ago, we added a non-binary gender marker to driver's licenses. We are one of the first states to protect transgender people who are incarcerated. In 2017, we passed a conversion therapy bill.
That was huge.
And then that was
Huge.
really huge. And I think for the first time, we had all 4 members of the legislative leadership signed on as co-sponsors and actively supporting the bill.
Yeah.
You know,
These aren't partisan issues. These are human rights issues.
Not partisan issues. That is just what I was going to say.
They're not. These are human rights issues.
Unfortunately, for too many of these bills, particularly early on, you know, we struggled to get any Republicans to sign on, and I'm happy to say that has changed. And last year, we passed a number of bills, including, and I know you were involved with this, the paid family and medical leave law, where we had one of the most expansive definitions of family in the country. So all those legal protections are so important, but there's legal equality and there's lived equality. And
Right.
a lot of the areas where we see intersections of race and immigration status, HIV status,
Right.
class, that's where a lot of the work still needs to be done.
Absolutely. All the intersectionality. And I would say, you know, I was kind of bagging on the Supreme Court at the beginning because I'm unhappy with what came out yesterday, but there was a big win this summer. So we should talk about the big win because that is really important. And our beloved Ruth Bader was still there for, that piece. So I'd love for you to just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, we have really, since I've been a lesbian activist since the mid 80s, we had one real loss, and then we have seen some very, very significant wins over the years. And this summer, as you say, there was a case called the Bostock case that was actually 3 different cases, 2 dealing with gay men and 1 dealing with a transgender woman who had been fired. They had all lost their jobs because of their either sexual orientation or gender identity. And what the court ruled was that Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 protects employees against discrimination because of sexual orientation or gender identity. In other words, those things are included in the definition of sex. And I think a lot of people, when we won marriage nationwide in 2015, there was this sense of the work is done. And
yes, we've had a few of those moments over the last 10 years.
Yes, and there has been one of the hardest things. I think maybe people listening to us talk today still don't realize that the majority of states in this country still do not have state protections for discrimination. Now with this Bostock case, gay and trans people are protected in employment, but in most of the country, they are not protected for housing, for the whole range of other issues, healthcare.
Right.
And so we have a lot of work to do that goes back to the importance of state legislatures, and those, all those other states do need to keep making progress. But one way that we can deal with that comprehensiveness is to elect a new Congress that will pass a bill that was passed in a bipartisan fashion in the House, but has, like so many things, stalled in the Senate. And that's called the Equality Act. And that will do what we passed in Connecticut in 1991, which provides those comprehensive protections for both gay and trans people.
Right. And the reality is that has not hurt anyone in Connecticut, right? It has only helped, and it doesn't interfere with straight people's rights. And it doesn't, I hate to put a fine point on it, but at the same time, it seems to be necessary because, love is love is love, and these are human rights. And I feel like the more that we can do to protect people's human rights, the better. I mean, I can think of so many friends of mine here in Connecticut who they choose to stay here. It's interesting. People talk a lot about the taxes and certainly the economy, and we always have to talk about that. But if you're living in a state where you don't feel protected as a human being, that is going to determine whether or not you stay or you go. And I've even had the conversation with my children, how you feel, before you take that job in such and such a state. Yes, you should look at all the economic factors of how much, what do the groceries look like there? What does rent look like there? What do the utilities look like there? But you also need to be looking at, okay, do I fall into protected categories or unprotected categories? Or what does this look like? Or I'm used to the laws in Connecticut. What do they look like in another state? Right. And that's not just about North versus South or East versus West or Midwest versus, East Coast. You really, I think people sometimes sort of poo-poo those other things, and you can't, because it really does matter if your life, it does not feel as equal as someone else's.
And you're going to feel badly if not just your life, but your friends' lives.
Absolutely.
Or, if you decide to raise a family,
Yep. Yeah, and then all bets are off what you quote unquote end up with. So that's for sure. You, as we say at our house, 3 children and all different.
Well, I'm interested. I'll ask you a question. As you have talked to voters, both this year and 2 years ago, how many people did raise concerns about the gay agenda in Connecticut?
Oh gosh, the gay agenda. No, I get more questions, and it's probably because I'm a Democrat. I think it's more around, what I will do to protect rights or to expand rights, or, the reason I like to knock doors and I like to make the phone calls myself, and obviously I have tons of volunteers that I'm grateful for that do that. But if there's an issue, or like I recently had one, it was about I believe the transgender child and medical care. And I just, it was a volunteer, and they had a great conversation. But my volunteer said, I really think this is one that you should, talk to. So I think generally when I'm talking to people, and I have to say, I don't really think it even matters what party affiliation they are,
Mhm.
because my attitude is you shouldn't have to experience it yourself to be empathetic towards whatever issue it is. And that's whether it's Black lives, our gay friends, women's issues, which are economic issues. You shouldn't have to, when we talked about Me Too, we kept saying, well, you shouldn't have to say it's about your daughter, your mother, your sister, you can see that this is an injustice and say that's not right without having experienced it yourself. And so I think that between folks who certainly have gay family members or trans, and especially like you said, the transgender thing has really evolved. I shouldn't say transgender thing, but the transgender movement, the transgender ability to sort of be out and be who you are and live who you are. I think that has changed even in 2 years.
Yes.
So many more spouses, so many more children. So I find that what I'm hearing more is, what are you doing to protect my loved one? Or what are you going to do to protect my loved one? And that's, whether it's employment or medical care or just, the things that we see in the news. So I do think that that's more it. I have to say, no one's ever actually said the gay agenda to me.
Good.
I have, it would be awful, but I would probably laugh a little just because I don't see it that way. But I guess some people might. So, but no, it's I think it's been really good. And so, we've talked a little bit about, we've been a leader, but we certainly have more to do. And I did, I'm thinking a lot about our young folks, and actually we have a question from one of the people watching right now. And the question is, how has the pandemic affected LGBTQ students with respect to access to support? And I know from some of the local organizations like True Colors, that, especially when, and the universities and the schools, normally they have clubs that they have access to.
Right.
So I even have anecdotally heard from, friends of other kids and what it's like to be home, especially if you're not out and you're home. It's a lot right now.
Yeah,
So
I think that is one of the things that I have heard through groups like True Colors and also anecdotally, is that a lot of kids, particularly in the younger grades, young people are coming out earlier and earlier as both gay, lesbian, bi, pan, and trans. And they are, I think they're more and more supportive parents, but there are a lot of parents who are not supportive, family members that are not supportive. And not only is it psychologically damaging, it can be dangerous, physically dangerous for these kids.
Yeah.
And so I think, this is when Zoom and the internet, if kids have access to the internet, can be such a wonderful support. But it has, it's been a huge impact.
I think about, my mom is soon retiring from 50 years as being a flight attendant. And so when I was growing up, I've told the story a few times, but, I had a lot of gay uncles and a lot of gay aunts. I had a lot of lesbian aunts. And so, get a little misty. AIDS was really brutal, and we lost a lot of people that we cared about deeply. And I can remember, going to see the quilt, and I can remember seeing the panels of people we knew on the quilt. And I think often about, that is the one thing that here we have this pandemic, but I think about what difference would the internet have made, right? Because that's something that, in terms of, I remember when Rock Hudson came out and did that press conference. And so it's sort of, that changed the narrative a little. And then, it's ironic that we've got Dr. Fauci working on the pandemic, considering his work during the AIDS epidemic. But I do think frequently about, while it is so hard for these kids, my hope is that because of things like the internet, it will be better than it was for my aunts and uncles with what they were living through and the isolation and and the fear and
Yeah.
the difficulty. And you lived all of
Yeah.
that. So you,
Well, and I think also just our culture has become more inclusive and more different
Mhm.
people's lives and experiences are reflected in music, on television,
Right.
in the movies. So
Yep.
if you've got a Netflix account, you can
Right.
likely see yourself reflected in a
Yep.
way that we couldn't, 30, 40 years
Well,
ago.
and I mean, I just think about Ellen, right? Because, and I know she's had her troubles recently with the talk show, but going back to the original show, and I was actually in college when that happened. I was a senior in college, and I can remember my gay friends and what a big deal it was for them. And in some ways, I think that, say, gay teenagers now or gay college kids now, it's still, I will not minimize it at all, because I know and have, talked to and seen and heard the bullying that still goes on. What I will say is that what a difference that 25-ish years makes
Yeah.
in terms of, I mean, Hillary Clinton wouldn't endorse gay marriage. I mean, it was, we had Ellen come out, she lost her show, she lost any jobs, people stopped going to her comedy shows because they thought they had to be, gay to go to one. I mean, it was ridiculous, right? And so I think about, you're right. I mean, it is such a, for all that work that went into so many decades before, it's sort of like a critical mass, and that's where we can't get comfortable.
Yeah, and I think that my wife Charlotte and I mean, I'll date myself that like a foundational moment on television was the
Right.
kiss on LA Law, which
Yes.
I bet you don't remember
I
that.
do
You
actually.
do?
Well,
Okay.
but again, because my mom, and I did watch LA Law, under the covers tucked in.
But it's just, I mean,
Yeah,
just
that
to
was a
think
big
back
deal.
there to Ellen to
Yep.
what we have now is
Right.
amazing.
Right.
But can we go back to COVID for a second? Because
Absolutely.
there's the impact of COVID on young people who
Mhm.
can't be in school or can't be going to the kind of clubs that they were going to before. But we're still learning so much. But we do know that communities that experience health disparities
Yes.
do much worse, and that the LGBTQ community,
Mhm.
we face all kind of health disparities. I mean, the use of drugs and tobacco and alcohol, HIV rates, cancer, a lot of that is because whether people are not out or people are discriminated against, they
Right.
just don't get the medical care that they should get. And when that happens, they're not going to get the COVID care they need.
No, and you're right. And even just folks being comfortable and being treated with respect when they go seek medical care,
Yeah.
that is such a significant issue. And I think that's, I'm proud to be endorsed by Planned Parenthood, and people, oh, Planned Parenthood. But you know what? The thing that they do that is so critical, in addition to providing, I can't even think about how many mammograms, thank God for Planned Parenthood that they are there providing those mammograms for women, but providing that respectful care with doctors and nurses where there may be no place else that you can access that. And that's why they are such a critical organization. They were actually one of the reasons why I even started looking at running, because I was actually at the legislature advocating for them. And so when you talk about those disparities, I mean, they're racial disparities, they're across the LGBTQ spectrum, they're it's all of it. And we have to make sure that there are those sorts of programs in place, because what people don't realize is that, I believe the number 2 years ago, and it may even be better now, for every they save the taxpayer $7 for every dollar they spend, or the way that they provide medical care. So for people who are so focused on the tax numbers, and I understand why, we certainly pay a lot of taxes in Connecticut. And I think it's critical for people to understand that organizations like that really are, beyond the fact that they provide this amazing service, they really are good for other taxpayers as well. So, but we have to really, whether it's Black maternal health or making sure that everyone has equal access to healthcare, you're right, the health disparities. And then are you less likely to seek care for COVID because maybe you've had that experience in the past with a physician, that's it's a very scary thing.
And when we're talking about the intersections,
Yeah.
when you're talking about the intersection of race and particularly
Yep.
trans women of color, and I
Yes.
think you know have a higher rate of homelessness,
Yep.
a higher rate of food insecurity, and those things are health disparities.
They are.
And I'll give a shout out to Planned Parenthood too. They have not just walked the walk, but they've
Yep.
no, if they've not just talked the talk, they've walked the walk around, reaching out to the trans community, to the African American community, to
Right.
the trans women of color, and you know, there are not a lot of places that will give them that those communities that kind of sensitive treatment.
There aren't. And then in addition, you know, to add into that, violence is a health disparity.
Right.
Because the violence against those women is so significant. And then where do you go? Where do you go when you have been attacked or when, you know, something awful has happened to, I mean, that is, there are just so many things that, you know, we have to be thinking about it. It happens to be a Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And so certainly, you know, that's on the list as well, but we've got to make sure, like you said, the intersectionality of it and addressing that and consistently addressing that. And that kind of takes us back to what should we be doing in Connecticut? You know, what should allies be looking at? And also what are you seeing as, you know, on the immediate horizon for what needs to be done?
Well, you know, I think we've referenced race a number of times as two white women. In the same way, I think that white people can't underestimate the power that we have to dismantle racism and white supremacy. Straight allies can't underestimate their role in confronting homophobia and heterosexism. And, you know, I think that the analogy is similar, that, you know, in the same way that we want to speak up when we hear a racist comment or joke, having people speak up when they hear something that's homophobic or transphobic. And I'll just say that, and Eleni, you do a lot of this, you know, in your work and in your campaigning. We've talked about the judiciary, we've talked about legislatures, we've talked about the executive branch. Public education and changing hearts and minds was so much of what we did when we were, you know, back in the 80s, when we were working on the gay rights bill and certainly around marriage equality. And just having people talk about gay and trans people that are in their lives, you know, talk about your kids, talk about your parents, talk about your aunt or uncle. That is so important. So that just storytelling is key, but we also need people who are out there advocating to change laws and policies. And again, you know this quite well, legislators pay attention. They don't need to get a whole lot of calls or letters to pay attention to an issue.
That's
so
right.
We learned, you know, when we, you know, 30 years ago, that sometimes when a legislator wouldn't listen to a gay person or a trans person, they would listen to their straight neighbor or someone who was in the Rotary Club or went to church or synagogue with them. So allies have a power sometimes with certain legislators that, you know,
and I think
doesn't have.
Like you said, the allies with the story. I mean, it's very difficult to, as a straight person, tell the story to someone who is in that position of power and them not to change their minds. I find that when you put it in terms of, well, if all life has value, you know, then let's talk about that. And I think that's a lot of what it comes down to. So I think that, you know, people don't realize the power they have in being allies for whatever the issue might be. But I always go back to, especially with women, you know, we recommend lipsticks. We recommend, you know, the best place to get takeout. We recommend the best, you know, place to get your nails done or your hair done, or, you know, oh, my kid has this and you should get it because it'll help you get them to sleep faster, and diapers. I mean, you name it. Whether, you know, even the senior women, I still hear them, you know, oh, you gotta try that orange juice. It doesn't have enough, you know. I mean, and I mean, these are silly examples, right? But that's the buying power, so to speak. And it's the same buying power that you have as an ally when you step up for an issue. When Carrie Firestone and I started Forward Connecticut, in the fall of, or the almost winter of 2016, that was what we said to people. Like, you're not going to get to all the issues. Yes, you care about the animals, and you care about the environment, and you care about gay people, and you care about Black people, and you care about immigration, but you have to really kind of narrow your focus, because you only have so many hours in the day, and you've got kids or a husband or a wife or a partner or whatever it is, and a job, and hopefully, and other things to take care of. So you really do have to pick your subject, and it's, or pick your cause. And then the more allyship you can provide to that cause, even, in a small way, an hour a week, whatever it is, that's really where you move the needle. And that's what we've tried to encourage people with so much.
Y'all have done such a great job with that. And we have to just realize that and trust that, these other issues are going to have people, and you choose the one that where your passion is, not just the one, but, a few where your passion is, and go deep when you can. And just going back to allies, I just have to make another shout out to the organization PFLAG, and just the amazing power that they have had, in our state and around the country, in changing the minds of elected officials, but also just people in their community.
Yeah.
I will say just one other thing that we can do as queer people and as allies is think about where you spend your dollars. Support the places that support the LGBTQ community, and educate. We all have to be educating ourselves. And as I said earlier, our seems to be changing constantly, and the lingo is changing constantly. And advice goes for me too, because sometimes my issues align with the bi or trans communities, and sometimes they don't, and I've got to educate myself.
Yeah, I think that's true for all the issues, and I think that's that's the as a former journalist, I love just being curious all the time because I want to know, and I want to learn more, and you don't want to ever be stagnant. You want to hear ideas from even the places that maybe you don't necessarily agree with, because that's where you often find, that you can not only just common ground, but it's like, well, you know what, that idea is not quite perfect, and mine's not either, but in the middle, we've got something like gold. So, that's,
I never thought about, that natural curiosity that is important to journalists is as important for elected officials, right? And I think that's why you are such an amazing candidate, because you feel your interest and your curiosity, both in terms of the issues and in just the personal stories in people's lives. So thank you.
Yes, and you'd be surprised how many of us there are that either seek elective office or already are in elective office that at some point in their life were in journalism. So it is helpful to be curious about other people in order to legislate well. So that's my hope. But anyway, well, Anne, thank you so much. This was great. I so appreciate your time. I think that the great thing is we do pin these to the top of the Facebook page. So if somebody missed it or wants to go back and hear other things, we have it there. We also have it at our teameleni.com site and on our Team Eleni YouTube channel. So lots of ways for people to hear this great discussion. And again, I just thank you so much. This was wonderful.
Oh, this was great fun. Thanks so much.
Okay.
Good luck.
Thanks. Okay. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.